So I'm double jobbing this morning, so I'm kind of jumping from one place to the next. Hi, Ed. It's great to see you all here this morning. It's lovely to see you all here. And we have our second week into the book of Exodus. During the week, I was amazed to read a story. I don't know about you. I read, I have a couple of news sites I go to every day. I try and go to them once a day, right? And that's it. Then leave the news after that. And actually, just as we were singing the last verse of that song there, and haste the day when faith shall be sight, the clouds roll back as a scroll. And I was talking to somebody as I was walking along the other day, and I was saying, there's all this news that happens in the world at the moment, you know, and there's such this crazy stuff happening. There's these dictators, and there's wars, and there's rumors of wars, and things can get kind of scary, you know. And I said, you know, I don't really get that scared when I read all that stuff. It doesn't seem to have much effect on me. And I think that the reason for that is because I think that I know how the end plays out, because I believe that Jesus is coming back. And that changes everything. It changes my perspective. It doesn't mean that we won't go through suffering. It doesn't mean that terrible things won't happen. It's just that the end game is sorted. And it's like you just know what the end is going to be. And for some reason, that gives me great comfort, even if that doesn't happen in my lifetime. So anyway, I was reading the BBC News website, and I don't know about you, but every once in a while you just read something and the headline just jumped out at me and went, oh, wow, that was amazing. And the reason I think that the headline jumped out at me was because it had such a correlation to the story we were reading last week and we're going to be reading this week. And the title of the article that I was reading is "The Midwives Who Stopped Murdering Girls and Started Saving Them." I thought, that's an amazing headline to read. And on the right-hand side of the picture that you're looking at is a woman in her 20s called Monica. The older woman on her left is a midwife called Siro Devi. They're from Bihar, a large estate in eastern India. What is extraordinary about this story is that in the mid-90s, it's likely that the lady who's crying on the left-hand side of the picture would have murdered Monica. Ciro and a number of other midwives, they featured in a report published in 1995 by an NGO based on interviews with them and 30 other midwives. If the report's estimates are accurate, and I imagine that they are, more than 1,000 baby girls were being murdered every year in one district by just 35 midwives. According to the report, Bihar at the time had more than 500,000 midwives. That's 500,000 midwives. So you can just imagine the possible genocide of young baby girls. And infanticide was not limited to the one province of Bihar. I also looked back at some stats of the difference in male and female, males to females in India at the time, and you can see that actually it was having an effect on the population correlation. Just in case you think that the midwives were somehow psychopaths, they were not. They were forced to kill the babies at the behest of the families to whom the children were born. In other words, the baby girls' parents. Why would they do this? And this is what one of them said in the report, one of the midwives. The family would lock the room and stand behind us with sticks. They'd say, we already have 4 or 5 daughters. This will wipe out our wealth. Once we give dowry for our girls, we will starve to death. Now another girl has been born. Kill her. And in rural India at the time, the police were not interested, and the midwives felt they had no one that they could turn to. However, in the mid-1990s, a brave young social worker called Anila Kumari, worked to change attitude amongst parents and particularly amongst the midwives. And she got all the midwives together and she said, "Would you kill your own daughter?" And this had a great effect on many of the midwives who became courageous and started refusing to kill the young girls, the baby girls. They began to rescue abandoned babies, and Anila arranged adoptions through an NGO. In the earlier service this morning, as we were talking about this, there was 2 little baby girls at the back of the church making some noise. They were just very small babies making noise. And it was heartbreaking to listen to it, to think that so many children were killed because they were not wanted. In this slide, Monica was one of those children, and she was saved from death by Anila, who arranged for her to be adopted by a family many miles away, and that is Anila Kumar there. And Monica is alive because of the courage of Anila, and indeed the midwives who refused to continue the evil killing of babies. So it's a story of courage and deliverance. And I was rather amazed to read this story, that it's so modern, and also that it so parallels the ancient story of the Israelites and Moses, which is also a story of courage and deliverance. The stories in this part of Exodus, Hebrews and the words Hebrews and Israelites are interchangeable. So when I mention Hebrews or mention Israelites, talking about the same thing, the group of people who were called Israelites because God had changed the name of Jacob to Israel, and they were his descendants. Last week we were introduced to some of the themes that feature in the book of Exodus. You'll remember that the descendants of Jacob were living in peace and harmony and were fruitful in every way. They had flocks, they had crops, and they had lots of children. And a paranoid king decided to start a genocide. And he first of all asked the Hebrew midwives to kill the children. They refused to do so. And his plan was to exterminate the tribe slowly by not having any males. His plan fails, and so in the end, he decides on a final solution where all male Hebrew children are to be drowned in the Nile or eaten by crocodiles. A dreadful, dreadful evil. And so we're introduced to evil on a grand scale. We see how Pharaoh stands against God. God has declared that the people will be fruitful. Pharaoh declares death. God says his people will inherit a land, but instead Pharaoh enslaves them. And so here's some of the themes that are already here in Exodus. Evil stands against good. Hatred and murder stand against fruitfulness and joy. And the power of man opposes and seeks to circumvent the power of God. So that's where we left the story. So let's read what happens next. We're reading from Exodus chapter 2 and verses 1 to 10, if you've got a Bible with you, or you can read on the screens. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "Ah, this is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." This is one of the best known stories in the Bible. It's one of the best known stories about the birth of Moses and about how he was hidden and he was on the boat and floated down the Nile. And how Pharaoh's daughter came and took him out of there. And as I was reading the story, I was trying to imagine what it must have been like at the time for his parents. Imagine the stress of being one of the Hebrew parents at that time. Imagine you're pregnant, or your wife is pregnant, and a child is about to be born. And what do you wish for? Do you wish it'll be a girl so that you don't have to go through the suffering of what might happen if it's a boy? Were you relieved when it was a girl? Were you stressed out of your head and full of anguish if a son arrived? How many babies were murdered during this time? How many mothers and fathers wept bitter tears? We don't know, but there was many. But even though the Hebrews were living through days of darkness because of oppression and evil, we see again that they did not submit to the evil all around them. They refused to do so. The midwives had refused to carry out the genocide ordered by Pharaoh. And now this brave couple defy Pharaoh and they trust God to do something with their beautiful baby son. Living in the shadow of an evil empire is not an easy place to be. It isn't in this world either. There are places in this world where living there is extraordinarily stressful for people because of the government that is seeking out to destroy them. Hiding out for survival and trying to protect the vulnerable must have been very, very stressful. And I wonder, did some of the people at the time wonder if God had simply abandoned them to their fate? But in the middle of Pharaoh's hatred and his attempts to erase the Israelites from the earth, an innocent baby is born. The author tells us that he is from a Levite family. He can trace his lineage back to Jacob's son, Levi. And though while it might appear to be of no significance at the time, the author is telling us for a reason, which we will find out later on in the story. I believe it's worth pausing for just a moment and thinking about how God's plan of salvation for his people has started with a birth on more than one occasion. When there is darkness in the land, light comes with a birth. Remember, Abraham and Sarah were promised that their offspring would become a great nation. They tried to do things their own way. God still provided a son, Isaac, even though they were years past childbearing. It only happened by God's direct intervention. Similarly, during the time of Judges, Manoah's wife was sterile. God gave them a son, Samson, who also became a deliverer for his people. Ruth was a foreigner in the land. She was childless. And through a series of incredible events, she has a son with Boaz that would become the grandfather to the great King David, who would also be a deliverer of his people. King David was anointed by who? Samuel, who was born because his mother cried out to God for a child. Samuel will be used by God to bring about his kingdom. Each of the children were born had special names. They were called by God for special purposes. So therefore, it's no surprise when Mary's son Jesus is born in unusual circumstances. He's given a special name because he will be the ultimate deliverer of God's people forever. Each time God intervenes directly into human events for the purposes of salvation. This time is no different. Moses' mother will not give him up to be murdered, and she hides him at home for 3 months. It must have been awful. Every time the child cried, I wonder, did she panic? Would somebody tell the authorities? Would somebody tell the soldiers? would they arrive at the door in any minute and take this little boy from his mother's arms. And yet this woman, who is later named as Jochebed, is strong. And she refuses to submit to the evil of the empire. The author then says something that appears a bit strange. He says that the boy's mother saw that he was good, or as the NIV translates it, a fine child. Now, there's no inference here that if he wasn't a fine child, the parents would have given him up to be killed. Some babies are beautiful looking when they're born, and let's face it, other ones look like E.T. There's nothing you can do about it, And, I won't make mention of any particular babies in this church. They're all gorgeous. And, but that's not what the inference is. The Hebrew word tob can mean good, whole, in good health, healthy, wholesome, fair, pleasant, beautiful, great, abundant, benevolent, kind, well-disposed, upright, honest, joyous. You're kind of getting the idea. The author's not trying to tell us that he was a cute, bonny little baby. It's likely that the phrase has been used more in terms of creation language. Like God saw it and it was good. Remember it says that in God talking about creation? That's the use of the word good. So this baby represents the birth of a people, the birth of a savior of God's people. Through him they will receive a new beginning. And it seems that Jochebed instinctively knows that this baby is special. Now, they're all special. Every one of them that's born is special. But she seems to have an idea that God has a plan for this little fella. And so we see another one of the Exodus themes emerge. Faith in the midst of darkness. She believes that God will do something. But she has a horrible decision to make. Her and her husband. It's horrendous. The baby's 3 months old and will likely be discovered if she hangs on to him. And so she decides, I don't know exactly why she decided this, but I'll put him in a basket and float him on the Nile. Seems like a kind of a crazy thing to do. The Hebrew word for the floating basket is literally an ark. The same word is used for Noah's mode of transport. And actually, the process that says, of putting bitumen and so on there, it's the same as the ark that that Noah was in. What is extraordinarily, when you think about this story, is that both Noah and Moses were carried to safety on the water that would be the destruction of other people. So Noah was carried to safety, and the waters covered the earth and killed everybody, drowned them. Moses comes to safety on the water, and that very water will be some of the water that will come down on the Egyptians when they're chasing the Israelites later on. Jochebed sends Moses' sister to look out for him, or at least to see what transpires after he's been left in his little ark on the Nile. She sees this royal party from the palace arrive. And I'm sure she was very anxious as to what was going to happen next. She's there told, watch your brother. Watch what happens. And she sees the royals coming. They probably would have had guards. I'm sure she was very, very frightened. But we read that Pharaoh's daughter doesn't upend the basket into the Nile. She takes pity on the crying baby. She looks at him, she goes, look. She's a lot less cruel than her father. And then Miriam, our marvelous Minnie, as I called her, she steps up to the plate and in an extraordinary display of cunning and bravery, offers to get a nurse who will look after the child. We presume that she meant a wet nurse, someone capable of breastfeeding the child, a practice, by the way, that existed right up to the 20th century in many well-to-do families. There was no formula around at the time. You couldn't pop around to the garage and get a tub of Optimil. I had to ask the earlier crowd whether they still sold Optimil, as my young ones are well past that. And I do remember one night, one little fella wasn't getting enough draft, and he was roaring and screaming at about 3:30 in the morning, and I wasn't getting any sleep. And I was dispatched from the house to go to the garage to get some Optimal and to boil some bottles and teats while I was headed off. And I remember the guy at the garage, he was, a hatch, and because the garage was all locked up for the night, and I said to him, now it has to be this particular formula. I had written it down. I'd been given very strict instructions as to what I was to get. And your man said, here, I'll open the door. He said, you can come in and get it yourself. You don't look like you robbed the place. And I went in, and he gave me what I needed. And I remember going home and getting the bottle and making it up and grabbing that little fella and shoving it into his mouth. And he emptied it. And then he slept, my wife slept, and I slept. And we were all delighted with ourselves. Anyway, that's only by the way. Pharaoh's daughter takes up Minnie on the offer, and Jochebed is sought out and now takes her son home to look after him. What a turn in events. That morning, we presume it's that morning, but she puts little Moses in the basket on the river. She's full of fear and anxiety, I imagine. She says, look out for your brother, see what happens. Terrifying. Now, she is being paid to look after her own son. Extraordinary. And more than that, no one would dare touch a hair on his head because he has come under the house of Pharaoh. Wow. And I think we can be pretty sure that Jochebed has Moses long enough to teach him who he is before she hands him over for his education with the Egyptian royal family. What a turn in events. I imagine from near disaster feeling to absolute elation and joy. I would imagine that when she got that little fella back out of the basket, she was bouncing him up and down as she went down the road with sheer joy. One more point before we move on. When I mentioned all the deliverers that God provided through the narrative of the Bible, you may have noticed that they were all men, correct? Whoever said that, you were right. It is men. Yes, thank you. Men. However, the men wouldn't even be here without the women, of course. And I'm not just talking biologically. Look at the early part of the Exodus story. Who were the ones who thwarted Pharaoh's horrendous plan? The midwives, who refused to kill the babies. The Hebrew woman who showed such courage in the midst of carnage. Jochebed, Moses' mother. Moses' marvelous sister, Miriam, who persuades Pharaoh's daughter to give the boy back to a Hebrew nurse. And it's Pharaoh's daughter who saves the boy from her father. It's all women. Maybe the further irony is that if Pharaoh had decided to kill all the women instead of the boys, he might have been a bit more successful. But he didn't. And so we come to another theme that is in the story, which is deliverance from an unexpected source. It's another of the themes of the Bible that plays out in this story. How often do we see it happen that God uses those we deem most unlikely to achieve his purposes? The Bible is riddled with examples, and so is the world today. And here's the irony part of this story that made me smile when I thought about it. The decree that Pharaoh made to rid all the land of all the Hebrews resulted in Moses' parents putting him on the Nile in a little ark. It's Pharaoh's own daughter that rescues the boy and brings him up in Pharaoh's household. Pharaoh's wish to bring death is turned by God to bring the boy to Pharaoh's front door, and instead of killing him, Pharaoh is the one who's paying for him to be nourished. Is that not extraordinary? God was at work, but no one could see it at the time. And I'm sure the Hebrews would not have thought of Pharaoh's daughter as being a suitable person to raise the person who would later on be God's representative. If you had a plan, it wouldn't have been that one, I don't think. Think of the story that Jesus told of the Good Samaritan. We must be very careful with our prejudices about who God is going to use. Because it was the very enemy of the Jew who was the savior of the man left to die at the side of the road in the story that Jesus told. We should therefore look for God at work in unlikely places and unlikely people to our minds when we see it. Not think, oh, surely God wouldn't use them. And certainly there can be sometimes a bit of an idea among us that, well, God would only use us. Of course he would. So why would he use anybody else? And the answer is that he often does. God uses unlikely people. And we're also thrown back to the parallel with Moses' ancestor, Joseph. Remember, his brothers tried to get rid of him. They tried to have him killed. And they sold him off to these traders. And then Potiphar's wife, she told a load of lies about him. She tried to get him killed as well. You would have expected him to be executed as a slave for attacking the master's wife. Except I don't think the master believed her at all. But in each of these instances, it also played into God's hand of deliverance from the people. What was meant to destroy, God used to give life. Now, that's extraordinary. And God still does that. Remember Joseph? The brothers arrive. First of all, when they handed him over, they were real powerful. He was only a lad. They were strong. They were together. They could do anything they liked with them. So they sell him. Now he's the head of the most powerful empire in the known world at the time. At least he's the prime minister. He's number 2. And they are there in front of him. And so they're terrified. And he starts off his conversation with them. He says, as for you, I don't think he was a posh Englishman, but anyway, as for you, you meant evil against me. I'm sure when he said that, they went, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. And so we see another of the themes of Exodus is revealed. Light shines in the darkness. Often, as I said, through the birth of a person. It's a lot easier for us as we read these stories to be bright and hopeful because we know what happens next. It's a whole different ball of wax when you're in the middle of pain and suffering, not knowing where it's all going to go. And yet Paul wrote these words, often misquoted, to the Roman church. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. It doesn't mean that everything is good. But what it does mean is that everything, no matter whether it is good or bad, God is at work for good purposes for his people. Truly terrible things happen to some Christians. In fact, really terrible things happen to some Christians just because they're Christians. Sometimes we are delivered from pain and suffering, and sometimes we are not. But what we do know is that God is with us, and he will always bring good, even from difficult circumstances. God is at work all the time, and we are required to trust him, even when it's difficult. I don't believe for a minute that God was surprised by the circumstances that the Israelites found themselves in, or the birth of Moses in the middle of a genocide. But God takes risks on the basis that he knows the outcome, and we have to take risks in trusting him, just as Jochebed and Miriam did. If they'd done nothing, what would have happened? Imagine that. They just kind of held on to the baby, we'll just see what happens. I think he would have died. But they did something. They took a risk. They believed God and took a risk. And sometimes we have to do that too.